We are going to be getting into everyone's favorite book of the Bible, the book of Numbers. Woo! I don't know if those were ironic claps or not. Numbers has a lot of good stuff in it, and there are a lot of stories that I think are ironically, even though it's in a book that isn't always the first one people want to open up to, probably because the census / genealogy, not genealogy, the list of tribes and numbers that occurs in the beginning. Nevertheless, there are things like the priestly blessing that gets said so often. It's literally the lyrics to the song, The Blessing, as well as some famous stories. We actually touched on one of the stories in the past, the story of Balaam, the pagan prophet who ends up blessing Israel. So we're not going to go into depth in that today. What we're going to look at is the vast majority of what is in the book of Numbers and why this book is still important for us today. Remember, we are going through this series, the Don't Skip a Book series, because in these books of the Bible, it's not only that these are God-inspired, Spirit-breathed books that can then help us vaguely apply things to our lives, but actually in each of these stories, we can find ourselves in these books. There are things in each of these books of the Bible that speak specifically to the human condition in a way that relates to us today so that we can know who God is and connect better with God. And so in the book of Numbers, we're going to look at a few ways that this book points us to a clearer understanding of God, as well as ways that we can find ourselves in the text. I wanted to talk first about my relationship with the rules. I don't know if it's like the way my brain is structured, or the way that I was raised, or just, I remember, I think it was in 6th grade, Mr. Foster wrote a letter home to my parents, and we had to have a parent-teacher conference in the 6th grade, and I hadn't had a whole lot of these things, and it was because I had gotten an I on my report card, which I don't know if you it's like lower than F, but no, it means improvement needed. That's what it meant back in the 90s in 6th grade. And the area of improvement needed, first of all, I'd never gotten anything bad on a report card before, so I was freaking out. Before my mom got home, I had opened up a composition book and I had written, I will not get an I on a report card. I will not get an I on a report card. I will not get an I on a report card. I started writing lines to punish myself for getting an I on my report card because I didn't really know what it was for, but I knew that it was a bad thing because O for outstanding and A for whatever A stands for, good. I knew that those were good things, but I knew that I was bad. So I was kind of freaking out about the I on my report card. But in the meeting with my teacher, we discovered what the I was for. The improvement needed area was that the way that I thought about reality was way too black and white. And once you hit 6th grade, there comes a point where if you're going to have meaningful, productive discussions, your answer to every question can't be a one-word answer. And so as a little kid, my answer to everything was well, what were the causes to this war or that war? I would have this caused it, the end of discussion, no more conversation. I've always had this way of viewing the rules and the answers as being well, if it's this, then it's this, and if it's not this, then it's that. And so I had a very black and white way of thinking, which in some cases is really, really helpful in life. It's really helpful in the maths. It's really helpful in waiting for your turn to cross the street. It's really helpful in all sorts of maybe important facets of life, but it can't apply to all of the facets of life. If any of you have asked me theological questions, I think I've gotten better at this, at being well, sometimes people answer it this way and other people answer it this way, and there's benefits to all the different angles because I have learned from that I on that report card. But some habits die hard. On the next slide, there's an example of one of the ways that this habit died hard. This is the writing across the curriculum essay rubric. Now, here's the thing about the writing across the curriculum essay rubric is that there's these 4 categories, and each of the categories is worth 5 points, and this rubric was developed so that all of the teachers across our school would be teaching writing skills, because it turns out that young folks have trouble writing. Is it going to work, you think? All right, let's pray about it. And because people had trouble writing, they were like, cool, in Bible class, they've got to write. In math class, they have to write. In history class, they have to write. And so we did this writing across the curriculum thing that started in 2014, and then that rubric got updated in 2016. This was spearheaded by the principal and the English department. This was in 2016 that I had this rubric, and what I understood from my superiors was that in every class you need to assign at least 3 major essays and use this rubric to grade those essays. In 2023, I was passing out this rubric, and I had a moment where I realized the principal that assigned this rubric was 2 principals ago. No one from the English department who invented this rubric still worked at this school. I began to wonder, and I asked some of my colleagues, and I said, hey, are you guys using the writing across the curriculum rubric? And they said, the what? What are you talking about? And I said, well, there's this rubric that we were all given that we're all supposed to be using for classes, and they're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Because here's the thing with me, is that if I'm given a rule and I know that I have to follow the rule, I have this thing where it just like gets lodged somewhere. Now, it's not all rules. It's like, for some reason, there's random rules that stick in my brain and then they don't get dislodged. And this was one of those rules that I discovered all the way until everybody else had given up on this. By the way, if you look really carefully at the top, it says Upland Christian Academy. That's not even the name of our school anymore. And I was still using the same rubric because someone over a decade ago told me to use this rubric a certain number of times a year. So I have a weird thing with rules, and I'm working on it and I'm trying to get over it. But this is the first thing we need to address with the book of Numbers, is because we talked about the book of Exodus, and there were some of these rules, and with those rules, there's the ways that the people of Israel were supposed to follow them, and those rules applied to the temple. And then we got to Leviticus, and we got even more rules that are supposed to explain what it means to be the people of God, how to harvest your fields and deal with the poor, and what do you do with body fluids, and all sorts of crazy things, different rules that they had to look at. And then you get to the book of Numbers, and there are still more rules. The rules don't end, but things change in the way that those rules are addressed. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking in the book of Numbers at how God and God's people interact with the rules, because there's a tension. And here's the tension when it comes to rules. That on one hand, the rules represent a timeless truth of some sort. Right? That there is something true that will always be true that is reflected in rules. But at the same time, there are timely realities that force us to address the way that those rules are interpreted and used. It is still true that young people need to learn how to write, even with ChatGPT. They still need to learn how to write. However, I can't cling to the 2016 Upland Christian Academy rubric that no one is using anymore, no one is enforcing, and is not consistent across the curriculum. There needs to be some adaptation because the world is different, the school is different, my supervisors are different, my students are different, and so we need to adapt. There is a timeless truth, but a timely reality simultaneously. And the book of Numbers is one of those interesting nexuses, fulcrum points, where these two things intersect in the Bible and in reality. And so we're going to look at 3 different ways that Numbers shows us this reality of timeless truths and timely realities. And the first one has to do with the daughters of Zelophehad. Everybody say, the daughters of Zelophehad.
Daughters of Zelophehad.
Or maybe just Zelophehad.
Zelophehad.
Is this everyone's favorite Bible story? Raise your hand if you've heard of the daughters of Zelophehad before. Nice. We got one Bible student. It's great. The daughters of Zelophehad is actually one of the most important moments in the book of Numbers, but we oftentimes overlook this because it just looks like another random law. The daughters of Zelophehad, their names are Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. So if we're looking for some baby names in the future, I think you've gotten them. Well, Noah's kind of normal, right? But the daughters of Zelophehad had this interesting situation. In the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, it lays out how land is supposed to get passed down from generation to generation. And in the original law, the laws kind of mirrored some of the laws of the other nations at the time, and that is that the oldest son is the one who gets the majority of the inheritance, and then the other sons get some of the inheritance as well. The problem with this is that Zelophehad did not have any sons. Zelophehad had 5 daughters. And those 5 daughters, they still hadn't gotten to the promised land yet, and they said, hey, so dad died, and we don't have any brothers. Which means when we get to the land, are we not going to get any land? Do we not get part of the inheritance? Do we not get a share of what God is doing in this new thing that we're going to be doing? And the daughters of Zelophehad, they came up to Moses and they were like, hey Moses, so the rules say that only boys can inherit, but you might notice that we are only girls. And our father, he wasn't the best of guys, but he didn't rebel against you like the other people rebelled against you. So can you figure this out for us? And here's why this is so significant. Is because what Moses does isn't just say, sorry ladies, the rules are the rules. It is what it is. I mean, I guess you lose your land and it goes to these guys over here. Moses goes before God. And when he goes before God, God says, they're right. This is a different situation. And because of that, they do need to inherit. So in the book of Numbers, literally right after you get all these other laws, God modifies his own laws to meet the new situation. God doesn't keep using the 2016 writing across the curriculum rubric. God says that rubric doesn't work anymore because there's a new situation that was good in its heart. So let's adapt the rubric so that it matches the new situation and includes this other thing that you people are facing now. Even though it seems like, okay, this is like minutia about laws about these ladies who want to inherit. No, this is so much about the character of God. Our God is not a God who said, I gave you the rules, you have to follow them, and if anything comes up, don't ask any questions. Your new situation is irrelevant. I've given you all the answers that you need. No, our God says, come to me and ask your question. Tell me your new situation. Right, the first thing that the book of Numbers shows us is that we have a God that understands nuance. He understands that, wow, this situation is different than that last situation. Like, you guys are in a time that's different than previous times, and as a result, man, we need to adapt some of these things so that it stays true to who I am as your God. See, it's not that God is changing. Right? It's that God is good and God is just and God is merciful and God is compassionate. All of these true things about God. But when the situation changes, what it looks like to be good and true and merciful and just has to shift with the situation because the situation is different. See, our God is not a static God who says, well, you guys need to adapt to me. Our God says, I see you. I understand how complicated it is to be you. And our God understands the nuance. So let's talk about this. Our God, let me put it in 2025. Our God is not surprised by AI, but he understands that the world exists differently than it did 10 years ago. And as a result, because it's different, we go to God and say, God, what do we do with this stuff? Given who you are, what do we do with these new things that we're facing? Right? What do we do with young people on social media? What do we do with relationships in the world between countries that are like seeming to like integrate like corporation entities as well? Like the existence of corporations is a relatively new thing historically according to humanity. Our God is not surprised by it, but our God understands the nuance and says, I still can speak into these situations. Go to me and my Spirit will help you to know what you are to do. See, this is what the daughters of Zelophehad did. They said, God, there's a situation. They didn't just go to a lawyer and try to argue about the laws. They said, Moses, let's go before the Lord and see what God wants us to do. So our God, he gets nuance. He gets the complexity of what it means to be the descendants of Egyptian immigrants in America in the 21st century. He knows what it's like to be young people who are torn between two different countries. He knows what it's like to be people who are trying to be faithful to him, but also not look like a total fool in a public school system. He knows what it's like to, or he knows the nuance of, okay, yeah, you do need to make money, but I also believe in justice. And so how do you make a living without thriving off of injustice? God sees the nuance in those situations, and he is the source that we go to when we're not sure how to navigate it all. That's what the daughters of Zelophehad teach us. It teaches us that God understands it. And the daughters of Zelophehad also points us to, if you say Zelophehad enough, it starts feeling like it's like just gibberish. But the daughters of Zelophehad also point us to one other thing, is that Numbers is history. And I know that this might seem like a no-duh thing, but they have to address this issue because they are going into a real geographic location where they're later going to draw boundary lines. If you read the very end of the book of Numbers, it's a lot of describing of a map, which is wild, right? Because it's enough to any of you guys map people that just like looking at maps for fun? Oh, I thought there'd be more of us, guys. When I read a fantasy book, my favorite is usually on the first page, there's a map and I'll screenshot it and I'll stare at the map for a good 5 to 10 minutes, taking in the whole thing. And as I read the book, and it's and then they went into the conquest of Arnor. And I'm like, where's Arnor again? And I'll flip back to the front and be like, let's look at the map again. You can tell that I was raised pre-GPS because I like looking at maps. But in Numbers, it's not a map, it's a description of a map, which makes it really difficult to read. But this is why it's important, is because Numbers is actually talking about a real place in real history, and they have to talk about the boundaries because they're about to do something in real history. And so it's important to know that in the same way that God knows the nuance of every situation, we also have to know that Numbers is not Lord of the Rings, it's not Harry Potter, it's not Narnia, it's not some fake world, but rather Numbers is real history, rooted here on this planet. And I know this might seem like a no-duh point to you guys, but when you read the Bible, sometimes you get the vibe a lot of these concepts, a lot of these ideas are so distant from us. This is 3,000 years ago, and we do life so differently that we can start thinking, oh, this is just like fantasy. Oh, this is a made-up thing that doesn't really apply to us anymore. This is like those people, it's kind of like once upon a time there was this place called Canaan, right? But the book of Numbers reminds us that it is not like that. It is real history in real space-time, and this actually does have consequences for us today, because the second thing that Numbers teaches us is that God is faithful in history, in real history. Not just kind of theoretically faithful. Not just God might be doing some things behind the scenes in your own personal life that you can then apply these principles and use it kind of like a myth. No. In real history, with nations and wars and people groups and races and grudges and finances and national boundaries, God works in history. When you look at the world today, I think it's easy to say, okay, I'm going to put God in this little private space that is my personal walk with Jesus. But then when it comes to, well, what's happening in other countries in the world? And what about the financial inequities across the globe? And what about the ways that some countries are actively attacking other countries? And what about peace accords that are trying to be reached in some places? And what about treaties? And what about things happening out there in the world? We think that, well, that's in a separate secular space called geopolitics. And in this bubble is my personal relationship with Jesus. But what the book of Numbers teaches us is that those two bubbles are a lie. That God is working in global history. God is doing something, even if it looks chaotic, even if it looks like, how are people ever going to find peace? Where's the goodness going to start happening? When are these things going to be redeemed? We have a God who is actually aware of all of that, seeing the nuance of the situations, but also interacting with real history. Which means that when there are things going on in the news, when you see things about Israel and Palestine, or Ukraine and Russia, or China and America, or this political party and that political party, when you see those things in the news, that is not something that you do over here and then like you do your personal relationship with Jesus separately. But rather, you get on your knees before God and say, God, let your kingdom come and your will be done, even between Democrats and Republicans. God, may your kingdom come and your will be done in Ukraine and Russia as it is in heaven. Will your kingdom come and your will be done in Palestine as it is in heaven. God, will your kingdom come and will be done across this broken planet, in the climate, in the politics, in the economics. May your kingdom come and will be done in real history. What Numbers reminds us of is that God is not just this private thing that you hold in your heart, but God is personal, and that personal God applies to the global. He's doing stuff in real history. And so we get on our knees and ask him to make it good, to make real history good. And the last thing I want to point out about the book of Numbers is actually, it's literally why in English we call this book the book of Numbers. Because guess what? In the book of Numbers, guess what there's a lot of? There are a lot of numbers in the book of Numbers, particularly in 2 chapters. Chapter 1, which is why sometimes people are like, I'll read the book of Numbers. And they get halfway through chapter 1 and they're like, maybe I'll read Mark instead. Because you get halfway through and you're like, okay, why do I need to know how many people are of the age 20 who are able to fight in the tribe of Manasseh? Right? You get these, why am I reading this thing? But it's actually really, really important because the numbers kind of serve as bookends to parts of the story. Now, in chapter 1, there is a count. And the count is how many fighting men age 20 and up do we have available to go do this thing that we're going to go get the promised land. And after they add up the numbers, there's over 600,000 men who are ready to do this thing. Then some stuff happens in the middle, and all of those men except for 3 die. And then they have to count the men again in chapter 26. And by the time they get to chapter 26, they do a little bit more math, and they're like, oh, hey, look, we're still at about 600,000 20-year-old or above dudes who can do the fighting. So it begs the question, I think Numbers is actually a good name for it, because the meat of the book happens between the numbers. It happens between the first census and the second census, because all sorts of stuff goes down and it reveals stuff about God and us as humans as well. And here's some of the stuff that goes down. First, in chapter 11, they're grumbling. There's some laws and stuff that get explained. We already talked about that. But in chapter 11, they're grumbling and complaining. Remember, they were just delivered miraculously from Egypt in slavery, and then they walked through the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, depending on the way you read the text. God has done these crazy miracles. He said, I am making you my people. And the moment they head out, they're like, oh, we're so hungry though. Man, when we were in Egypt, remember when we were slaves and we would eat fish sometimes? And when we were slaves, we would have meat sometimes? Oh, remember when we were in Egypt, how great it was? When we were slaves. Because at least we had meat then. And so God has to respond to people's grumbling and complaining. He's like, okay, fine. I'm going to send quail, which is it's a fairly large bird that you can knock on the head and eat. And so God responds to their grumbling in his grace and compassion. He's like, okay, even though you're complaining and spoiled little brats, I am going to still feed you. Another thing that happens is shortly after they leave Mount Sinai, Aaron and Miriam, his brother and sister, Moses' brother and sister say, hey, why is Moses the main guy? Aren't we important as well? The way that they put it is, doesn't God speak through us as well? And so Aaron and Miriam kind of start to do a little discussion. They start to say, why shouldn't we take over as well? And then Moses then has to have this weird confrontation with his brother and sister who are jealous of the fact that he's Moses, who's kind of leading this thing. After that, We'll unpack this in a second. After that, they get to the land of Canaan, the place that they're supposed to go. They send the spies into the land, and then 10 of the 12 spies say, apparently God brought us here so that we could die. There are giants there, and they're going to crush us. We look like grasshoppers to them. We're done for. And they complain to Moses, did you bring us out here? Did you rescue us from slavery just so we could be killed in battle in another land? Now there's two guys who are like, these are the two guys that make the cut that end up in the numbers beyond chapter 1 in chapter 26. Two guys, Caleb and Joshua, they come back and they're like, we can do it, guys. If God is with us, remember all the stuff he's already done for us? If he's with us, we can totally do this thing. But the other 10 guys are like, nope. And most of the tribe, most of the people of Israel is like, yeah, we're with the guys who say we should have just died in Egypt. So that happens also. And then to make matters worse, God is like, okay, fine, you're going to wander around. We're going to wait for the next generation. Which, by the way, fun fact, sometimes that's the move, is when there's a whole generation that doesn't want to see God work in a separate way. It's not like God is like, I'm done with people, but he's like, all right, let's just wait for the old people to die. And maybe the young people will do something different, which is a warning and an encouragement to you guys, because there's a lot of young folks in the room. One, as you age, do not be one of those old people that turns their back on God and stops caring about the kingdom of God. Do not be one of those old people that's like, oh my gosh, it just can't be done. Stay your young idealistic self even when you're 80 and in adult diapers. Stay your young idealistic self that believes that God can do crazy things. And for the young folks, know that there is a responsibility. I think sometimes when you're young, you're in a place where you're like, okay, well, I'm young and so the adults are running things and so I guess I'll just hang on here. But sometimes you are the ones that God chooses to do the things that he wants to do in this world. Okay, so additionally, after that, he's waiting for this generation to die out, there's a guy named Korah. And this guy named Korah says, well, I'm a Levite, and I feel like I should be special among the Levites. And so he starts a rebellion against Moses, and then Moses is like, okay, here we go again, another rebellion. First it was the food, and then it was my own brother and sister, and then it was the people who thought we were going to die in the land, and now this guy has this whole massive group of people who wants to rebel. It was like a few hundred people who took up arms and were ready to attack so that they could take over everybody and be like, we are now in charge. And in that, Moses is like, I don't know what to say, guys, but how about we just let God decide? And then in the moment when they were going to line up to attack Moses, the earth opens up. Maybe there was an earthquake, I don't know exactly what this looks like, and all of those soldiers fall into a pit in the ground and die. And so Moses is like, okay, I guess that wasn't the move. And so he continues on. And then last, right before the count, there's one more thing where there's a bunch of ladies of Moab who are like, hey guys, you know what would be super fun? Why don't you want to have a little fun with us, and we can worship our gods as well. And so there's this other thing that goes down where Israel turns their back again on God and says, how about we worship idols instead, because I like the way that these Moabite women look, and so we'll get in bed with them, and while we're at it, let's sacrifice 2 false idols as well. So the book of Numbers has like failure after failure after failure after failure after dark moment over and over and over again, right? And here's why I'm bringing all this up. This is important because this is all the stuff that happens between the numbers. This is all the stuff that makes them have to think, well, what is going to happen in this next generation? And what I think it reveals about us as humans is also what it reveals about Moses. I think we see something in Moses' character that reflects who God is, but then also gives us an encouragement about how we ought to be as well. So we're going to read some scripture together, so could we all rise together, stand up on our feet as we read the Word of God. This is Numbers 14, starting in verse 13. If we're looking for context, this is after the people of Israel say, did you bring us out here so that we can die? And then God's like, oh my goodness, why don't we just kill them all and I'll start a new nation with you? But then Moses says this back to God. Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. They have already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, and that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, then nations who have heard this report about you will say, 'The Lord was not able to bring these people into the land He promised them on oath, so He slaughtered them in the wilderness. Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared.'" And then he quotes this thing that we actually did a series on last year. "The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, in forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now." The Lord replied, "I have forgiven them, as you asked." You can be seated. Even given everything that the Israelites did against Moses and against God, notice Moses' posture. One, he's watching out for God. He's like, "God, you had this great plan, and people are watching us, looking to see what you are going to do. I want them to see your glory, God. But I recognize that they've done messed up stuff. But even though they've done messed up stuff, even though they've even rebelled against me as their human leader, can you show your love and compassion and forgive them? Can you give them another chance?" In Moses, we see what a good leader looks like. We see what a good follower of God looks like. In all of those things, like the reason I had to tell you all of those things is because if I just give you one example, you'll be like, okay, everybody can forgive sometimes. But what you see in Moses is that even while people are rising up against him and doing evil, he is still saying, "But God, I believe that they can do something. I believe they can be forgiven. I believe that you can still work through these broken people. You've revealed this in the past, and I know this to be true, that you can work through broken people." He defends the aggressors, the bad guys. On top of that, he doesn't just say, okay, so therefore there is no evil, but rather he still speaks truth to evil. And every one of those confrontations, he doesn't just say, "You guys are right, Korah, take over." He says, no, let the Lord decide. This is how I've lived my life. These are the things that I've done, but I'm going to speak truth to you right now, that you guys are in the wrong. But I'm going to and that's the next thing, and I'm going to let God validate me. I'm not going to just beat you up. I'm not going to fire you. I'm not going to send you in the desert to die, but I'm going to say, let's bring this before God, and I will let God validate me. And Moses also, in all of this, he continues to be faithful. He continues to say, "God, I want to see your plan carried out, even when it gets rough." And all of that stuff about the numbers and all the things that went down I think that this is the other thing that Numbers teaches us. This is the last thing. Is that Numbers shows us what godly leadership looks like. Now, Moses is a godly leader. However, there are some moments in his life where he drops the ball. He's not perfect is the thing. He is godly in general, but he definitely has some flaws along the way. Like so much so that he ends up not inheriting the land, right? He doesn't go into the promised land with the rest of the people because he was flawed. But we get an example, we get a glimpse of these traits of the divine. And I think that just like every single one of these other books, first of all, each of these books that we're covering, I think they are beautiful and good in and of themselves. But they are good in and of themselves because they point us to God, and when we want to know what God looks like, the clearest thing that we as Christians have is to look at Jesus. And in the book of Hebrews, he says this, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. See, what he's saying here is that Moses is a reflection of the goodness of the builder of the house. That Moses was like this house, but the house is just a reflection of the architect who designed the house. And when we want to know the architect, we look to Jesus. It literally, if you're reading in the NIV, you know how sometimes the translators give you like a little heading of what that section is called? In Hebrews 3, it's Jesus is the greater Moses. That we have an example of what it means to be a godly leader that's even better than Moses. But Moses got us to see what that might look like, and then Jesus fulfilled what that looks like. And he ties all of these pieces and numbers together, that Jesus was a historical man, a real human being in history, who lived a real life in a real place, in real historical geographical locations. And he was a historical, godly leader. Think about the things he says on the cross. In the same way that Moses advocates for a broken people before God, Jesus on the cross says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. But he speaks truth to power in the same way that Moses does when people are rebelling. That Jesus is the true godly leader, the true exemplar of what it looks like to live a godly life in the flesh. And Jesus, he gets the nuance. When he came and he spoke on this earth, he spoke like a first century Palestinian Jew, because that was the context he was in. But nevertheless, he spoke with reason. He spoke with the ability to see through the underlying cultural contextual issues of the day, and he could address those issues while also giving timeless truths that we can still live out today. In Jesus, we have a real God in concrete history, showing us what it looks like to be a redeemed human who understands us because he became one of us. And what Numbers points to is that we can trust that God. We can trust that Jesus. We can give our lives to that Jesus to change this world through us. Something that he started literally 3,000 years ago, he is still doing today. And we can do it by trusting him and following him into the way that he wants this world to be. Let's pray together, and we'll sing one last song together as we wrap up.